Welcome everybody to today's webinar. The webinar is titled Soviet Jewry Movement's 60th Anniversary, the Cleveland Pioneers Who Started It All. My name is Miriam Rosenblum. I am one of the leaders and founders of the Soviet Jewry Movement Archives Project, sponsor of today's program. I want to acknowledge and thank the 7 co-sponsoring organizations for this webinar today: Action for Post-Soviet Jewry, American Jewish Archives, Union of Consuls for Jews in the Former Soviet Union, Vanderbilt University's Department of Jewish Studies, Western Reserve Historical Society, the Weiner Jewish Family Heritage Center, Yeshiva University Archives. Thank you. During the webinar today, if you have any questions for our guest speaker, Professor Shaul Kelner, or about the Soviet Jewry Movement Archives Project, please post them using the chat function. The Soviet Jewry Movement Archives Project, SJMAP, as the organization is called for short, is preserving and sharing the history of the grassroots activism that first started this human rights movement in 1963 and then propelled it across 3 decades. This activism would ultimately alter the lives not only of Jews living behind the Iron Curtain in the Soviet Union, but also the lives of thousands of activists in the United States and elsewhere in the Western world who joined this battle. SJMAP, with your help, is working to find and unite the materials that document this grassroots movement and make them available to all through a single point of entry on the SJMAP website. And when I say with your help, it means we seek assistance to locate relevant materials that need preservation, and we seek assistance to finance the many steps necessary to bring this wealth of materials together on SJMAP's archival hub. SJMAP is equally focused on educating and empowering people today and in the future generations. Using the growing resources on SJMAP's archival hub as a springboard, SJMAP will teach about the power of each person's voice, the strength of activism on a grassroots level, and the lessons learned from previous campaigns to counter anti-Semitism. Today's webinar series is one component of this work to share and demonstrate that grassroots activism can indeed cause change. Our pursuit to gather and unite the materials of this 30-year movement gives SJMAP the opportunity to work with many organizations. One of these, the Western Reserve Historical Society in Cleveland, holds the archives of the early pioneers and of the records of the very first Soviet Jewry advocacy organization, the Cleveland Council on Soviet Anti-Semitism. In partnership with SJMAP, these early records at the Western Reserve Historical Society will soon become more accessible to all via SJMAP's archival hub. Joining us today from the Western Reserve Historical Society is Dr. Sean Martin, who will serve as moderator of this webinar. Dr. Sean Martin is the curator for Jewish history at Western Reserve Historical Society, where he oversees the Cleveland Jewish Archives. He is the author of the book, Stitch in Time, The Cleveland Garment Industry, published in 2015. He is also the co-editor with John J. Grabowski of the book, Cleveland Jews and the Making of a Midwestern Community, an edited volume of essays on different aspects of local Jewish history. Dr. Martin has also written extensively on the history of Jews in 20th century Poland. Sean, I will now turn this over to you.
Thank you so much, Miriam, and good afternoon, everyone. Good evening. It's wonderful to have all of you here for the webinar. I have the real honor and privilege of being here and of introducing Dr. Shaul Kelner. Shaul Kelner is an associate professor of sociology at Vanderbilt University, sociology and Jewish studies. He's the author of Tours That Bind, Diaspora, Pilgrimage, and Israeli Birthright Tourism, published by New York University Press in 2010. And then for our purposes and interest for this webinar, he is the author of the brand new publication, A Cold War Exodus, How American Activists Mobilized to Free Soviet Jews, which will be published very shortly by New York University Press. And I'm sure it will be a publication that will interest all of us. I just want to add that we were very pleased to have Shaul write on the work of the Cleveland Council on Soviet Anti-Semitism in our volume, Cleveland Jews and the Making of a Midwestern Community. That was how we met, and we were very pleased that he used the resources in our archives. And Shaul, we're looking very much forward to hearing your talk this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sean. Thank you, Miriam. It's good to be here. And the materials that I used to do this research, some of them are now available, actually, that anyone who's on this webinar will be able to see through SJMAP. A lot of the stuff is still not, and we can talk in the Q&A about the dilemmas of doing research when you have to travel all over the world, and the materials are only in paper, only in one place. So we're going to talk about the Cleveland pioneers who started it all. This is the 60th anniversary of the Soviet Jewry movement in the United States. And there's a question that people who study social movements ask, which is, how do you date the start of a social movement? So we know, for example, that in the 1950s, a group of rabbis from the RCA, the Rabbinical Council of America, traveled on a mission to meet Soviet Jews, and they reported back. We know that there were materials that were being delivered to Russian Jews in the 1950s through Chabad. There were lots of ways that people were doing things. There was a protest here or there, and there were organizations. Synagogues would sometimes say a prayer or mention this. But one of the main ways that sociologists who study social movements will try to date the start of a movement and distinguish it from antecedents, or the bubbling up that leads to the start of the movement, is to focus on the creation of the first social movement organizations. And that happened in 1963 in Cleveland, Ohio, with the creation of the Cleveland Committee on Soviet Anti-Semitism, later renamed the Cleveland Council. And we're doing this now in April 64, which also marks the founding of two other organizations, the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry and the American Jewish Conference for Soviet Jewry. And the Cleveland Committee on Soviet Anti-Semitism was a participant in the very first national gathering of lots of organizations as well. But the Cleveland Committee, and we're going to go back to October of 1963, when they were the first organization that was created before anything else existed as a single issue organization focused solely on Soviet Jews. And this organization begins as a committee of the Jewish Federation, and it begins out of a book club that is happening in the West Temple, Beth Israel Temple in Cleveland. This was a synagogue that was really not in the center of Jewish communal life in Cleveland, but out on the outskirts. And possibly it's because they were out on the outskirts that they were able to do what they did, because they had a lot of independence and they had a group of people who got together and were talking, and they were book club, they were reading about issues. And among the issues that they were reading about was the dilemma or the problem that Jews in the Soviet Union were facing. There was an article that was published in 1963 in Foreign Affairs magazine that focused on the status of Soviet Jews. And the members of this book club, who you can see here under CCSA's founders, read this and discussed and decided they need to do something about it. And what they initially did was they began writing letters. And they wrote letters to national Jewish organizations saying, what are you doing? And what, as a community, collectively, as American Jews, are we doing? We need to organize around this. We have organized first. We now have one organization that is devoted to fighting for Soviet Jews. Now let's create more, and let's create a national movement. In April of 1964, two organizations were created: the American Jewish Conference on Soviet Jewry, which was founded, it actually was a conference, it was a gathering of 24 major Jewish organizations, and they gathered in Washington, D.C. to coordinate community action on Soviet Jewry. But it was unclear whether at the end of this gathering, the conference would dissolve or would it continue on and do something. And the activists from Cleveland, from the Cleveland Committee, had prepared. And they were convinced that the important thing to do nationally was to make sure that we had a national organization that had an independent budget, an independent staff, that could take on this issue of Soviet Jewry and make it a priority. And among the things that Lou Rosenblum and Herb Caron prepared from the CCSA was a document. It was a pamphlet about what they had done back in '63. And they called this Soviet Terror Against Jews, how Cleveland initiated an interfaith protest. And they circulated this to show Jewish organizations around the country what is possible, that even one local community could do. Imagine what we could do nationally. But they were concerned. And they were concerned that this conference was going to end and dissolve, and the organizations would go back to business as usual, and there would be no follow-up. So they proposed a resolution. They got together with some other delegations. They proposed a resolution, and you can see this at the bottom left of the screen. And this was a resolution essentially to propose that after this conference ends, an organization continues from it, and that the organization will have financial support and will have staff support. And this resolution passed. And it was a resolution that came from the floor. It was a resolution that came from Cleveland activists. The same time that this American Jewish Conference was being created, there were a group of students in New York, and they were meeting in Columbia University. And the leader, who was not a student himself, he was a British immigrant named Jacob Birnbaum, said, "We don't need a conference. This problem is so big that we need a great international struggle." And this organization, the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry, gathered at the very end of April, and they gathered on a Monday. That Friday was May the 1st. And if you know something about the Soviet holidays, May 1st is International Workers' Day. It's May Day. It's the day of international solidarity for workers. And so they decided what better way to celebrate May Day than to have the first demonstration for Soviet Jews, and they marched outside the Soviet mission to the United Nations. And with that protest, they inaugurated 3 decades worth of public protest for Soviet Jews. Now, Cleveland was the pioneer, not just in creating the first organization, but its work in the 1960s and into the 1970s seeded much of what would become known as the Soviet Jewry movement. So in each of these pictures, you'll see here Lou Rosenblum. Lou Rosenblum, this is Miriam's father, by the way, was the founder, one of the co-founders of the Cleveland Committee and Council on Soviet Anti-Semitism. He did a number of things, and he really, really took the helm and went beyond Cleveland very, very quickly. So the Cleveland Committee on Soviet Anti-Semitism, among other things, published, along with Student Struggle, they published the first guides for activism, handbooks for activists. You can see it here, Hear the Cry of the Oppressed. They were the first to, Lou Rosenblum actually traveled the country to help independent Soviet Jewry groups start up in other cities around the US as well. And when the Cleveland Committee changed its name, it became independent from the Federation, and it changed its name to the Cleveland Council. The local groups in a lot of the places took the name Council. So you had the Bay Area Council for Soviet Jews, and lots of other local groups that called themselves councils. And if you're looking here, you're seeing Lou Rosenblum, the bottom right, and Bob Wolf and Zev Yaroslavsky as they were gathering. And they're from Florida, from California, Cleveland. They're on a flight to Moscow. When they get to Moscow here, you'll see Lou with Refuseniks. They helped to pioneer connecting directly with Soviet Jews. And we're going to talk a lot about how they did that. They also published the first national newsletter called The Spotlight. And the idea was this, that in order for American activism to be effective, we can't just have local organizations each doing their own thing. And we can't just have a national organization that's floating up there. We need a network of local groups who are coordinated with each other, who are sharing information with each other, who are able to plan and coordinate action across the United States. And from Cleveland, Ohio, from an office in on a Triscuit, is it Avenue or Lane? Triscuit Avenue, I think. In the West Synagogue, they essentially networked a national movement by traveling to meet new activists, to seed local councils, to create newsletters, to publish a handbook, what are you supposed to do, and to press for greater national coordination. In 1970, the local councils decided that they were not going to wait for the major national Jewish organizations to create an independent organization. The American Jewish Conference on Soviet Jewry at that point did not have an independent budget, and its offices were being shifted around to AJC, NACRAC, and the like. And after years of pressing, the leaders of the councils, led by Lou Rosenblum, with a lot of work also from Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry, Jacob Birnbaum, Glenn Richter, and others, decided that they needed simply to act on their own. They saw that there was a vacuum in leadership, and they decided to go and fill it. And they went to fill it by creating their own national umbrella agency, which they called the Union of Councils for Soviet Jews. And this move, along with some pressure from the Israeli government, forced the hand of the large Jewish organizations who also reconstituted or reconstructed the American Jewish Conference on Soviet Jewry into an independent, fully staffed, budgeted national conference on Soviet Jewry. Now, Soviet Jewry movement, like any good movement, is going to have factions. And the factions will fight each other on lots of things. They'll fight each other on strategies. They'll fight each other on tactics. They'll fight each other on goals. It's a very, very normal thing for movements to be factionalized. People are passionate. They care. And people want to get directly involved. And the more people get involved, the harder it is to coordinate everything under one single umbrella. So people gravitate toward the type of activism that speaks to them. And there is a sense among activists in the Soviet Jewry movement that there was a grassroots, the councils, and an establishment, the establishment being made up of the federation system, the national congregational movements, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, the Reform Movement, the Rabbinical Council of America for the rabbis from Orthodoxy. And they understood themselves as a grassroots versus an establishment. And part of what I was doing when I was studying this movement was looking to see how did these different factions work together and forge what really became a common movement culture. And among the things that I found were that there were a number of local councils, including the Washington Committee for Soviet Jewry, the South Florida Conference on Soviet Jewry, and the Greater Philadelphia Council for Soviet Jews, that were members both of the Union of Councils, the grassroots umbrella group, and the National Conference, the establishment umbrella group. That is to say, in certain places at the local level, this grassroots establishment split wasn't really a split. There were organizations locally that were able to network these two different sides. And what happened was the ways that some of the grassroots work was being done was filtered so that the establishment groups were doing it started doing it that way, and vice versa. These organizations, even though they call themselves grassroots establishment, really had network connections and they managed to create and forge a common movement culture that people who were not that engaged in the Soviet Jewry movement, but who were participating marginally. For example, the children who were learning about it in the Hebrew school, the parents of kids who twinned their bar and bat mitzvahs, they may not know whether the Soviet Jewry movement organization they were working with was from this faction or that faction. The activists, of course, knew, but for most American Jews, it just looked like to them a Soviet Jewry movement. In New York, there was a Greater New York Conference on Soviet Jewry, which was headquartered in the same offices as the National Conference, but whose leadership was made up of veterans from the student struggle for Soviet Jewry. So there's a lot of cross-pollination. I want to talk about the key tactical innovation. And this is the key tactical innovation that really shaped the way that Soviet Jewry activism got done in the 1970s and 1980s. And much of what American Jews remember about the Soviet Jewry movement is coming out of that time period. And it is the result of a tactical shift that started in a lot of places, but that was first articulated in Cleveland in work that Lou Rosenblum himself had written. And the key tactical innovation was this: people to people. It was a shift from thinking about Soviet Jews or Soviet Jewry as an undifferentiated mass. No names, we don't know who they are. They're Jews of silence, can't name them, to activism on behalf of named Soviet Jews. Ida Nudel, Natan Sharansky, Anatoly Natan Sharansky, Vladimir Sleepak, Masha Sleepak, Dina Belina, and others. When Elie Wiesel goes to Russia in 1965 to do the travel that will lead to his book that really became, it was a Bible of the Soviet Jewry movement, The Jews of Silence, Les Juifs du Silence, Judea de Mama. This book was translated, I think, into something like 18 languages, including Japanese and Finnish. In Elie Wiesel's book, he barely mentions the name of any Soviet Jew. He talks about their eyes. He talks about how he meets a Jew, and who is the Jew? They're all the same. It could be any Jew. It could be a student. It could be a soldier. It could be a homemaker. But they're all the same because they're all suffering the same thing. These Jews of silence don't have names. In the 1960s, when we marched for Soviet Jewry, we marched for the group. And if you look at the signs that the protesters at this march in Cleveland in 1966 are carrying, you will see something that's very different from what you're seeing in 1979. In 1979, they know the names of the Soviet Jews, and they're able to advocate for them individually, specifically. How does that change happen? That change was also pioneered in Cleveland. So there are little things that are happening all over the place, but it's going to be articulated first through the Union of Councils through their people-to-people program. So what's going on, actually? In Southern California, the Southern California Council on Soviet Jewry and California Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry, led by Cy Frumkin, Zev Yaroslavsky, get the idea to create prisoner of conscience medallions. This was the same time that there were POW MIA Vietnam War bracelets, and we were beginning to learn the names of Soviet Jewish activists who had been arrested and thrown in prison, put in prison camps for their activism, and we were able to get their names. And once we knew their names, we could advocate specifically for their release. And so out of California councils, we're getting medallions. You might wear an Anatoly Goldfeld medallion. Someone else might be wearing an Anatoly Altman. You had your prisoner that you were taking care of, that you were adopting, that you were going to be advocating specifically for. Out of the Washington Committee for Soviet Jewry, a children's handbook on Soviet Jews is published that includes a list of the children of refuseniks and invites children to pen pal with them. Not only do we know the names of Soviet Jewish adults, we know the names of the Soviet Jewish refusenik kids. We're going to advocate for them too. In South Florida, the South Florida Conference and in Philadelphia. Bernie Dischler in Philly, Joel Sandberg in Miami. They're joggers. They love to run. And when they were in the Soviet Union, they met a refusnik who also was a jogger. We like to think of jogging as an American thing, but evidently in the Soviet Union, they were doing it too in the 1970s. Yuli Kosharovsky was a runner. And at one of the Union of Council's national gatherings in 1978, Bernie Dischler and Joel Sandberg went out for a jog early one morning and were talking about their friend, the runner, Yuli Kosharovsky. And Bernie Dischler said, you know, I had entered a race in Philadelphia and I made a t-shirt that said, I am running for Yuli Kosharovsky. And I can send you that t-shirt, Joel, and you can wear it too. And he did. And he registered himself in a race. It was a Hanukkah run. And he registered both himself and Yuli Kosharovsky. If the Soviets would not allow Yuli Kosharovsky out to run in this Hanukkah race, then Joel Sandberg would run on his behalf. And from that, we got a slew of freedom runs in the 1980s. The very first freedom run for Soviet Jewry, which took place in Los Angeles in 1979, was dedicated specifically to Yuli Kosharovsky. Kosharovsky had applied to emigrate in 1971, and he emigrated only in 1989. He was the longest refusnik of all. And when he came out in 1989, he came to Philadelphia. They had a freedom run, and he and Bernie Dischler ran together. And Bernie Dischler, he changed his shirt. His shirt said, I am running with Yuli Kosharovsky. And you know what Yuli's shirt said? I am Yuli Kosharovsky. There was travel. There was direct travel. Now, you've already seen Miriam on the screen. You're seeing her again on the screen, along with Sheldon Benjamin. They traveled to the Soviet Union. How could we connect with Soviet Jews? We could go directly to meet them. Not only do we now know their names, we can be in the same rooms with them. 1968, we get direct flights from New York, between New York and Moscow. And all of a sudden, it's a lot easier to go over there. And so we send tourists to go. And we bring aid, we bring moral support, we bring material support, and we bring information back. Names, addresses, legal status, health status, information that we can use to advocate for them directly. This was sometimes dangerous. And these two travelers were actually arrested and expelled from the Soviet Union. But they have lived to tell the tale. In the 1980s, we paired our bar mitzvahs with American Jewish 13-year-olds and Soviet Jewish 13-year-olds. Direct advocacy where children, 13-year-olds, would get up on the pulpit, on the bima, and say, today I am a man, or today I'm a woman, and what it means to be a Jewish adult, a responsible Jewish adult, is to speak out for Soviet Jewry, and I am speaking out for. So in my bar mitzvah in 1982, I spoke out for Leonid Baras. He was the son of a journalist who was applying to emigrate and had been refused. And many, many people did this. About at least 10,000 kids did this. It was in the 1980s. It was very hard to, if you were going to bar and bat mitzvahs, it was very hard not to encounter a twinning at some point. So how does all this happen? Boris Kuchubievsky is the very first political prisoner, Jewish political prisoner whose names we know. In the late 1960s, we begin to advocate on his behalf. And as all these things are bubbling up with advocacy for individuals, in Cleveland, the Union of Councils gives a name to this. They call it people to people. And what happens in Cleveland, and this is published in a handbook, there are several versions of the Cleveland handbook. The first one is in 1965. And if you look at the proposals it makes, it's all about general consciousness raising. It does not mention anything about mailings to Soviet Jews or adopting people or twinning or pen pals, anything like that. No medallions. We don't know their names. In the 1970s edition, under the heading of people to people, we have tourism, we have greeting cards, we have a whole slew of ways that you can directly engage with Soviet Jews. And that reshaped the movement. All the slides I had showed you before are the tactics that those who were involved in the movement in the 1970s and 80s remember doing, the ways that they were directly connected. And that stuff, even though it was bubbling up in different places, it got its articulation. And the person who recognized, oh, this is what we are doing and this is how we mobilize, was Lou Rosenblum in Cleveland. And the reasons that he made this move in this direction they're complex. There were a lot of things that were going on. Part of the reason was that at the time, the Israeli government did know the names of Soviet Jewish activists, but they kept that information very closely, and they could use that information to try to control what movement organizations did. And in Cleveland and in other councils, they understood that unless they had a direct source of information, a direct channel to Soviet Jews, they would not be able to function independently. And so that organizing people to people under one heading was a way to gain strategic and operational independence for the Union of Councils. It was also a way to directly engage many, many, many more Americans, because now each person could be advocating for a different Soviet Jew. And through working on behalf of the individual, we were also working on behalf of the total, of the collective. None of this would have happened were it not for the activists in Cleveland. And it is appropriate that earlier this year, or in October of 2023, a historical marker was unveiled at the West Synagogue to mark the founding of the Cleveland Committee, later Council on Soviet Anti-Semitism. The councils, the Bay Area Council, which pioneered the greeting cards and then got picked up by Cleveland and sent out to the UCSJ, the tourism, the twinning, the medallions, all of this really was the result of work that began with the founding of the first independent, single-issue Soviet Jewry organization, Cleveland, and the work of the local councils that were seated and then came together to form a union of councils where they could work coordinated together. And this was really, it was the first movement organization, and it was the first movement organization dedicated as a single issue organization. Most of the factional differences simply were the result of single issue organizations versus organizations that had Soviet Jewry as part of their plank, but had to do many, many, many other things at the same time and had to balance. But in the end, they really all did rally around the same cause, and we had a unified Soviet Jewry movement culture that shaped the texture of Jewish life for a generation. So thank you, spasiba, to all these archives and funding sources, and to Soviet Jewry Movement Archive Project, and to the dozens of world-changing activists who shared their stories with me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shaul, for such a great discussion and an overview of the presentation. I just wanted to start with a couple questions, and I hope we will get some questions from others. If they could submit them to the chat, that would be terrific. So I guess two questions really for you. One is I wondered if you could also kind of take the history a bit further and talk about the history of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment and how that fits into the history. It's a Cleveland connection, but it's also taking kind of the grassroots movement further to a real successful point.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, happy to do that. So the Jackson-Vanik Amendment was a proposal for legislation that would tie our trade policy, American trade policy, with the Soviet Union to free immigration rights in the Soviet Union, essentially. It's a little bit broader than that. But this was a time of détente, and both the Nixon administration and Brezhnev administration in the Kremlin were trying to smooth economic ties and build. They didn't want us to blow each other up, and they tried to calm things down. But this came at the price of Americans ignoring human rights abuses in the Soviet Union. And so opponents of doing business as usual or business as better than usual with the Soviet Union put forward an idea to link our trade policy with their human rights practices. We'll give them trade benefits, but they have to let people go. They have to allow free immigration. And it was launched by Senator Henry Jackson, who is from Washington State, and on the congressional side by Representative Charles Vanik, who is a representative for the district that the CCSA was based in. So there's a local Cleveland connection right there in this bill. And it was a controversial issue because it basically put the American Jewish community up against the Nixon administration, because Nixon administration wanted better trade ties and were opposed to this amendment. But the Soviet Jewry activists said, but not on the backs of Soviet Jews. And so they were organizing with congressional allies in opposition to the presidency. And that's not an easy position to be in for a Jewish community that has many interests, in Soviet Jewry being one of them. You know, the Yom Kippur 1973 Yom Kippur War was going on at that point, and would moving forward on this amendment affect U.S. support for Israel? Because that was a threat that was on the table. When the administration pressured the Jewish community, activists in Cleveland made phone calls to talk with the refuseniks themselves and said, "What do you want?" And they heard from the refuseniks, "We want you to stand firm on this amendment." And it was at that moment that the activists said, "All right, this is what we're doing," and they rallied support, and the amendment eventually passed. There are lots of debates. One of the main debates among the scholars is to what extent did the amendment itself help encourage more immigration, or did it actually lead to less immigration? Because in the immediate aftermath, the Soviets closed the gates a bit, but then in the long term, they opened them again. So that debate continues.
For that explanation. The questions are coming in, so just let me kind of work through them. We're getting some comments about thanks certainly for the presentation, and thanks to the activists of the 60s and 70s for all of their work, and some more general questions that we'll get to, but I wanted to kind of see if I could put them in a bit of order. I'll start with the next one. About the schism between the organized Jewish community and the council activists. Did the schism ultimately hold back the overall movement, or did it provide creative abrasion?
I think it provided creative abrasion. I know that some of the activists themselves may disagree with me on this, and I was a kid. I was marginally involved in the movement. I twinned my bar mitzvah. So in studying this, one of the difficult things in studying this, I'm speaking with activists, on all sides, and people are very, very invested in the roles that they played. My sense of it was that as a Jewish community, we were stronger by having independent groups that were able to push a little bit harder and farther and faster, and also large consensus building organizations that had very, very good connections in Washington, and were able to reach into synagogues and Jewish community centers all over the United States. And so even though I would imagine that for the activists themselves, they were experiencing this tension, looking back at this as a historian and a scholar of social movements, to me, that tension actually helped the movement to succeed. And without that, it's not clear that we would have been able to. But that may not be a popular opinion. I don't know.
We do have a few questions. Let me ask you one more specific questions, and then I want to get a few questions about the SJMAP, the Soviet Jewry Movement Archives Project. Do you think that a grassroots movement today, following a similar path but with added social media grassroots methods, could be effective today?
For what cause?
Well, I think they're asking for about any cause, really.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in my mind, it's the only way. It is the only way. You need grassroots activism. That's what pushes things. And that's where I see the main factional difference between being single issue organizations versus organizations that had Soviet Jewry as one plank and had to balance their Soviet Jewry activism with other things. And they need to build consensus. They have a lot of things, right? They have a lot of constituencies that they have to address. single issue activists on whatever cause are able to say, we're doing this and only this. And they can exert pressure on the organizations that have multiple agendas to prioritize their issue. So for example, I think about the environment, for example. Now you have Jewish environmental organizations saying, this is the main issue. This is what we have to focus on. And you have other Jewish organizations that this is one thing among many, but how much are they going to do if they don't have the people who are, we're doing environment, that's it, pressing them? And how effective could the environmentalists be if they're not able to get those larger organizations on board?
One more specific question, because we're getting a couple of comments about the work of Mark Talisman, the young congressional aide who was so involved in the movement in the 70s.
Yeah.
Would you be able to share anything about his role?
Super involved in the legislative dimension of this and key in it. I did not study the legislation. All that stuff has been written really, really well by a lot of others, including Gal Beckerman in his great book, When They Come For Us, We'll Be Gone. What I've been looking at was the grassroots, and basically the people whose names you don't know. You know, the people who were just, they were head of a synagogue committee who were doing things, and that what they did in that synagogue somehow went national and went viral, if you can say that something in the 70s went viral. So I've often spoken about the Soviet Jewry movement in terms of heroes and very, very famous names. Sharansky, I was doing this research. People said, did you talk to Sharansky? Did you talk to him? Yes, I spoke to Sharansky. But honestly, I spoke with Lou Rosenblum, you know, and that conversation with Lou Rosenblum, that was the conversation I needed to have. You know, so I was speaking with, I spoke with Sue Summers. I spoke with Carol Mandel, also from Cleveland. They were involved in very early tourism work. I spoke with Maurice Shapiro a lot from the Bay Area Council about all the work that they were doing. You know, and he also had information about activists who had passed away who I couldn't speak to. And that's really where this movement needed everyone in their different positions. And the fact that we had so many activists dedicated, like they had full-time jobs, they were dedicating their lives to this, all over the country, all over the world, actually, is what made this thing a success. Don't forget the unsung heroes.
Thanks so much. So one of the very first questions we had, Miriam, was how you can help. And you've directed everyone to SovietJewryArchives.org, but can you tell us more about SJMAP?
Sure. As I referred to in my opening comments, we're working on two levels. One is to try to capture all pieces of the grassroots history before it gets lost, and lost in the sense that more and more of the activists are no longer with us, and their documentation and materials that they use are sometimes getting thrown out. So we're trying to capture conversations, oral histories with those who still remain, and to make sure any materials that have not already found their way into archives are gotten there. We are serving as matchmaker if people reach out to us to find the appropriate archival historical organization to preserve them. And then the next step we're doing is we are working to make these materials much more available. We have just started, in fact, a digitization project, as I mentioned, in Cleveland at the Western Reserve Historical Society. There are many more historical organizations that we either are or will be working with who are at various stages of preserving those materials. On our website, SovietJewryArchives.org, we have created a single point of entry. We call it an archival hub, where we point to all the archival organizations that have this information, and that eventually you'll be able to click through to see documents like Shaul has been sharing with us today, so you can do your own research on different aspects. And it will also make it possible for researchers to get a better idea much faster about resources that are out there. The last thing, and not the least at all, that we'll be doing is, as more and more of these materials get more readily available, we're going to be working with educators and other organizations here in North America and beyond to create avenues and ways to share this material, educational opportunities, encouraging researchers and graduate students to focus on these topics, embedding it in schools in human rights curriculum. The list goes on, and we're only beginning to understand what all the possibilities are.
Thanks so much. Shaul, can you tell us what it would mean to you to have the materials online in a format like SJMAP would provide, and how that works for you as a researcher?
Yeah, absolutely. So I can tell you a bit about the experience of writing a book before there was an SJMAP. So I had to travel to archives in Cleveland, New York, Minneapolis, London. I actually got digital materials from Israel because I was doing my research during COVID time. And I had travel plans. I was going to be going to archives. The archives shut down. I couldn't get to the materials. The only materials I could get at that point were materials that were scanned. I could go to interlibrary loan and I could get microfilm delivered, but there was a time when even interlibrary loan was closed down. I had a colleague from another university. I needed a book, like it was an old primary source text. I couldn't get it from that library because it's COVID. She went in, she borrowed it from me, she sent it to me, I sent it back. That we had to make do. This was a global movement. These archives are scattered all over the world. And to study it just requires an enormous amount of travel of suddenly in paper. And who knows, the travel is always going to be accessible. So having these materials digitized online in a single place that you can access from wherever you are makes research into the broad scope of the movement possible for anyone from anywhere. And without that, this is going to move research on the Soviet Jewry movement forward by leaps and bounds, because it's going to open so much to so many people who would not have the resources to do all this travel, to go through all the paper stuff. And then also the fact of digitization also enables modes of research that you can't do if you're working with actual paper.
Thanks so much. I'd like to we're getting lots of comments and questions. And I think what I'd like to do just in the last 10, 15 minutes we have is if I could read a couple of the comments and then go back to a couple of the questions, I think that might be good. So we're hearing from Robert Aronson. As another facet of Cleveland's leadership in the movement in 1988, Attorney General Reese reversed the presumption that Soviet Jews had a well-founded fear of persecution. As a result, the U.S., acting through its consulate in Rome, began denying refugee visas, and a population of Soviet Jews developed in the Rome area, in particular Ladispoli. A real estate attorney in Cleveland, name unfortunately forgotten, initiated a grassroots effort to get attorneys to take a stint in Rome to develop and prosecute applications for Soviet Jews. I was the third attorney who participated in this effort. We have high level of success, and ultimately the presumption of denial was reversed. Let me just go through and point out a couple of the other comments. We had a comment from Edith Paller about the work of Mark Talisman. And let's see, we have a comment from Jed Margolis about his accompanying his father, Henry Margolis, to meet refuseniks and to certify Hebrew teachers. And let's see, there's a lot to go through. So let's get to some of the questions. Let's see. Just a moment. Alex Ellentook is asking to please elaborate on details of several waves of immigration from Russia, particularly about the 1978 wave that is called the second wave. My family left the Soviet Union in 1978.
Essentially what the Soviet Jewry movement did, we knew that, activists know, you cannot force the Soviet government to do anything. But what the Soviet Jewry movement did is it made the emigration of Soviet Jews, not emigration from the USSR generally, but specifically emigration of Jews, a Cold War issue. And what that meant was that when the Soviets wanted to signal good relations with the West, they could open the gates. They would open the gates. And this was in the lead up to the SALT II negotiations, and it was a time when they wanted to be seen as playing nice, and so they allowed many more Jews out. Of course, the flip side of that is if they did not want to signal good relations, they could use closing the gates as a signal of that as well. And we saw that happen in the 1980s when the immigration rates went down to the levels that we had seen in the 1960s before there was much activism. Most of the research that I did, I will say, did not focus on, this is a book about American Jews, not really about Soviet Jews per se. It's about how activism in the United States shaped American Jewish culture in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, the late Cold War period. This really became part of the fabric of American Jewish life. And in cities across the country, I saw, did you cover this community? Did you cover that community? Yes, Chicago, yes, Boston, you name it. Colorado. This was a national movement, and in doing this research, to do it well, I really had to look nationally, because this was not something that was just headquartered in one part of the country. It was not something that was just confined to one demographic. This engaged from students to elderly, from children to elderly, all ages, cities, small towns, rural, everywhere.
Thank you so much. We are getting lots of interesting comments, and I'd like to just make sure that everyone on the webinar is aware of them. So let me just kind of read those out, and we've got other questions too for both of you. We have a comment from Alexander Smukler. He says, one of the largest collection of Jewish samizdat and documents now belongs to Wendy Museum in LA. I would recommend adding this organization as an important institution, which is preserving and digitizing thousands of documents related to our topic here. We have a comment from Beryl Polnick. I've been a member of Beth Israel the West Temple for 36 years. I've been honored and privileged to know many of the Cleveland Council founders as fellow congregants and friends. As the advisor teacher of the junior youth group for many years, one important activity of our group was our close long-distance friendship with the Jewish youth of Murmansk, Russia, for several years, and more recently, the Jewish youth of Kaliningrad, Russia. Through FaceTime and Zoom, we celebrated Jewish holidays, made and sent gifts to each other, shared our own Jewish customs. It was a valuable and meaningful connection to the smaller Jewish communities of Russia. Sadly, this connection abruptly ended when the Russian invasion of Ukraine occurred. A comment from Wendy Zohar. Was a child of the initial grassroots movement from Beth Israel, the West Temple. I don't remember the book club. It started as an expression of the Synagogue Social Action Committee, which searched for a focus cause to which to dedicate their efforts. Once they recognized the enormity of this crisis happening to our Jewish brethren in the Soviet Union, they started reaching out nationwide to gather accurate current information and also to invite support. One last comment from Boris Kelman: appreciation to all work and efforts that have been done. It is refreshing memories from that time when I and a lot of others were refuseniks in the former USSR. I was privileged to work with the Union of Councils. Thank you so much for organizing this event. Just a couple more questions, a couple for you, Shaul, and we have a question for Miriam, and that might be our time. But I have to scroll back to make sure I get them correct. We had a question about, a message from Ala Khan. Can the model of the Soviet Jewry movement serve as an inspiration and a model for fighting anti-Semitism in America, and especially on American university campuses? And I guess we can pair that perhaps with, there was another question about the use of, here it is from Isabella Tabarovsky. Did the Soviet Jewry movement note that Soviet anti-Semitism at the time presented itself as anti-Zionism? Did it cause debates within their ranks as to whether anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism were the same? What was the prevailing perspective?
Yeah. Okay, I'll take the second question first. No, at the time there was no debate. And it was very, very clear that anti-Zionism was anti-Semitism in the Soviet context. The Soviet Union officially, by its official doctrine, was opposed to anti-Semitism. So when they're pursuing anti-Jewish policies, they need another way to frame it. And they're not talking anti-Semitism. The term itself comes up in the 1800s to talk about oppression of Jews based on race, which is different also from the religious anti-Judaism that preceded it. The Soviets were not thinking in racial terms, but they were oppressing their Jewish community, and they tended to do that in political terms by saying that Jews were aligned with imperialist capitalists. They talk about Zionism as colonialism and imperialism and capitalist and aligned with the West. So yeah, that intersection, or that the nature of Soviet anti-Zionism as the way that Jews were being oppressed was perfectly clear. Now, part of the reason it was perfectly clear is we were in America during the Cold War, and this was the Soviet Union that was doing it. So it was very easy to see when it's the Cold War enemy that is treating its Jews this way under the name of anti-Zionism, that this in itself is a problem, and they didn't need to get into these definitional questions of is this type of oppression of Jews the same as that type of oppression of Jews? As for the first question, I want to point to this issue of oppression. I think that's the key thing, and I think it's one of the key ways that the Soviet Jewry movement can help us think about anti-Jewishness, however you want to define it today. We often in the States will talk about anti-Semitism as a prejudice, as bad psychology. We'll talk about them as incidents, hate crimes, or the like. We'll talk about it as stereotypes, as cognitive. The Soviet Jewry movement understood very, very clearly that what was going on with Jews in the Soviet Union was oppression. Anti-Semitism is oppression. And we don't speak about it like that now. And if we can remember that from the Soviet Jewry movement and begin to look at our own situation in those terms, in terms of power relationships, in terms of subordinating, trying to keep Jews down or out or the like, we'll be thinking in Soviet Jewry movement terms. I think we'll come to a much better understanding of the nature of anti-Jewishness, not only as it exists now, but really as it had always existed. I see the prejudices, the stereotypes simply as the result of power relations that are subordinating and oppressing Jews, not the cause of them.
Thanks so much for that. We've got maybe 5-10 minutes left if we can go just a little bit over. I wanted to just address a question that someone had about the Historical Society, whether we use volunteers in our work. And I would say, yes, we have used volunteers. I'm very, very grateful that I had the opportunity to work with Miriam's parents, Lou and Evie Rosenblum, on the processing of all kinds of collections. And if someone I should say that it is at times easier for us to work with volunteers than other times, depending on what projects we have going on and when. But if you're interested, please don't hesitate to contact the Historical Society and be in touch. I'd like to perhaps ask one last final question to Miriam, and before we can wrap up with comments. We had a question from Amy Budish. Miriam, was there something in your dad's past that inspired him to leap into what he knew to be a risky and difficult advocacy effort? Was he an activist in his youth, or just a regular guy who saw a wrong and needed to right it? Could he be an inspiration for all of us who think, oh, I couldn't do that because he possessed special talents?
Well, but I will say the slide that Shaul showed at the beginning that showed the 6 people who were really the ignition for the original group, they were all driven with that along the same line. This was recently after the Holocaust. They started their social action committee at the advice of then Rabbi Dan Litt to do reading into it. So they were reading about the Holocaust, what was available then. And then they turned their conversation to, are there other Jewish communities in peril now, in need? And that's when they started researching what was out there. They were motivated by trying to correct what the American and the Jewish community had and hadn't done during the Holocaust, and to do better. So that is what initially motivated them, and started the initial efforts. And then my father leaping off, moving nationally, was in part due because through his work at NASA, that was his full-time job. He was often all over the United States. And so he started to piggyback and use the opportunity when he was in other communities to start networking and meeting and discovering people.
Thanks so much. It really, that's a great reminder of the great work that this takes on the part of all these grassroots activists who are also dealing with professional lives and personal lives and causes that are quite dear to them. There was a mention about the book again. I wanted to remind everyone that the title is A Cold War Exodus: How American Activists Mobilized to Free Soviet Jews. It's available from New York University Press. You can find it online easily, and I'm sure it will be available through online booksellers and in good bookstores. Miriam, Shaul, other comments, questions?
I just have a few closing comments, unless Shaul has anything. Okay. So
Just to
first
say
of all,
thank you.
sure. And thank you, Sean Martin,
Yeah.
moderator today. Thank you, Shaul Kelner, for taking everyone on a journey through those early years of this movement and the initiatives that built the people-to-people programs that truly made the Soviet Jewry movement a people-to-people effort that was between individuals on either side of the Iron Curtain. Professor Kelner's new book, A Cold War Exodus: How American Activists Mobilized to Free Soviet Jews, will be published in just a few weeks in late April by NYU Press. You can pre-order the book now, and there is in fact a 30% discount offer for participants of today's webinar. More on that in a moment. As I mentioned at the beginning, this was the inaugural webinar from the Soviet Jewry Movement Archives Project. We look forward to welcoming everyone back to future events when we examine many more topics that spring from this human rights movement. And I invite you to learn more about the work of the Soviet Jewry Movement Archives Project and the grassroots efforts at our website, Soviet Jewry Archives, that's with an S, archives.org. You can explore our archival hub on this website, both today, and I suggest you keep coming back over the coming months, because we are actively populating it with more and more materials as these materials become available to us. I also invite you to support SJMAP's work. Help us to populate the archival hub. Help us take the next steps to create and share the dynamic lessons of these collected histories. Please consider a donation to SJMAP. Our success really depends on your support. And at the conclusion of these remarks, you're going to see information on how to order a copy of Shaul Kelner's book and how to support the work of the Soviet Jewry Movement Archives Project. There'll be 2 closing slides that will flip, and they will remain visible for the next 5 minutes to give you information, including QR codes for how to order the book with the discount and for how to get more information and to support the Soviet Jewry Movement Archives Project. So I invite you to linger for a few more moments for that opportunity. Thank you to our speakers, and thank you to everyone who joined us today.
Yisrael, Am Yisrael Chai. Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael Chai. Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael Chai. Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael Chai. Hey, O Rabbeinu Chai, O Rabbeinu Chai. O Rabbeinu, O Rabbeinu, O Rabbeinu Chai. O Rabbeinu Chai, O Rabbeinu Chai. O Rabbeinu, O Rabbeinu, O Rabbeinu Chai. Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael Chai. Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael Chai.